In this first video for Module 17, we consider caves and cave systems. So let's start with this question. When we consider how caves form, how many types of methods for cave formation can you name? Can you name some ways that caves form? So caves are created by, well, one way they're created is through pressure or flow, the pressure of water or the pressure of volcanic material like magma that's pushing underground. That's exactly how this cave in the photo to the right was formed. That's a lava tube in Hawaii. But caves like this can also be formed by water pressure. A second method is by erosion. And pretty tall sea caves exist in places like the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California. Some of those caves, or really all those caves, created by erosion, and we'll talk about those a little bit later when we look at coastal processes in a future video. The type of cave formation we're going to talk about the most today is dissolving rock, where a weak acid in water as it moves downward through soil and rock will actually remove some material and deposit it in other places. So we're going to talk a little bit about a chemical weathering process that forms caves. So before we get into that, I just want to throw out a couple of definitions. Karst is a type of limestone topography that has a lot of caves, and karst comes from the Slovenian words meaning rocky and oak. And I'm showing a couple of interesting locations in Slovenia. If you're not familiar with that country, it's south of Austria in Europe, a little bit north of Italy. Karst topography happens or is formed where dissolving bedrock has created sinkholes, sinking streams, caves, springs, other types of features. And karst is generally associated with limestone, but it's also associated with other types of rock material like marble and gypsum. But we'll talk mostly about limestone. So where can you find karst topography in the U.S.? Well, a little background on the U.S. or the area that's now North America 75 million years ago. During the Cretaceous period, there was a massive inland sea that covered much of North America. And that inland sea, the bottom was covered with sediments carried by rivers, sediments that piled up over time and built on the bottom of this ancient sea. Then later, uplifting brought that rock upward, and it was exposed. And today, you can find it in various places in the U.S. in the form of limestone. And here's some of that limestone that's found in the U.S. today. We see much of Florida is covered by limestone, but also parts of Texas and the Missouri Ozarks and elsewhere in the U.S. We have lots of places where there are limestone deposits and karst areas in the U.S. Karst is all about plumbing. Karst topography is all about water moving down through rock layers. So I thought I'd show you some entry points for water. One of those would be just a big hole, like this opening right here. It looks like this bike trail just sort of disappears. So water goes in, and it may emerge. Its exit point may be a spring, as shown here on the view to the right. Another example of how water might enter cave systems, disappearing streams like this one. So the stream just sort of flows and just disappears into a hole, as shown here on the diagram to the right. We call these deranged streams, and they're pretty odd, pretty unusual. And they're found in places like Kentucky here in the U.S. Scientists have done work to try to see what the plumbing is all about, where the water originates, where it flows, and how it gets down into caves and emerges in the form of springs. So here's sort of a dye tracer test at the surface, and where you might find that dye tracer, the green water, that gives an indication of where that water from the surface was traveling. Okay, a little bit about the another entry point for water is just the overlying rock. So when you have rainfall, so imagine rain flowing here or falling here, as I shown in this animation, and that rain coming in contact with vegetation at the surface, where that vegetation helps to make that water a weak carbonic acid, so a very weak acid, and that water that's a weak acid will pass down through soil and through subsoil and eventually down into bedrock, where it will absorb, where the water rather not absorb, but where it will dissolve a little bit of limestone and carry that limestone downward. And that limestone may be deposited somewhere lower in that process, perhaps in a cave, in the form of stalactite or stalagmite. So we'll look at some of those things. Here's the way these caves look. They oftentimes have multiple levels, sort of like different floors of a house. And this is sort of a cutaway view of a cave, so you can sort of get and appreciate what they look like. These limestone karst caves. Here's at the bottom of this one in the center, you see an actual river, underground river. And just so you can appreciate how big some of them are, this particular cave was formed by water flow, and you can sort of imagine the water swirling up in the top of this dome to create the dome. And just for scale, just so you can get an appreciation for how big this cave is and how much water must have been involved, this is a person rappelling down a rope in the center of the slide, so that's pretty massive. Speleothems are cave features, another word for cave features, coming from the Greek word speleon and thema for deposit. These are stalactites shown in this photo, and you see the water dripping on them. And imagine that water is that weak carbonic acid that's has just a little bit of limestone deposited in it. And as it drips from the top of the cave, it just leaves a little bit of that limestone behind, and that's what forms into the stalactite or stalagmite. Here's stalactite. Hanging from the ceiling and with water dripping. And we'll kind of look at a couple of, a little bit about stalactites. So you might say, what conditions are necessary for stalactites and other cave decorations to form? So let's take a look at some of those just for a minute. So here are some conditions needed for the formation of cave decorations, another way to describe those things found inside limestone caves. The first thing, fractured or jointed surface limestone. You have to have a way for the water to travel down through the surface limestone, so there has to be some cracks or joints. So that helps. Moderate rainfall helps. So not heavy rainfall, but moderate rainfall, generally in excess of about 500 millimeters a year. And some surface vegetation that contributes to the acidity of that water. That makes that weak carbonic acid, or contributes to it. So those are three things, but we'll look at a couple of other things related to stalactites. These are soda straw stalactites. They're so described because they're hollow, hanging from the ceiling. And so we actually say groundwater traveling downward has a carbon dioxide content of about 250 times that of cave air. And that as that carbon dioxide is released from droplets of water, calcium bicarbonate is left behind. So it can't remain in solution without the carbon dioxide. So here's that sort of a close-up view of a soda straw, and they're hollow. As water goes down through the center of it, water also drips along the side of it. Again, as that carbon dioxide is released and that water evaporates, it leaves behind a little bit of that material to form the stalactite. Here's a lot of soda straws, and they're pretty delicate, as you can see. And as noted in the caption, they grow longer and faster than wider stalactites. So these really thin ones do. Here's some thicker ones. Sometimes when those straws become blocked, water is forced to run on the outside of the stalactites, and that forms this thing called a carrot. So these great big things are called carrots. How fast do stalactites grow? That's a pretty good question. As we say here, the average growth rate of a stalactite is about 0.0051 inches per year, or 1/2 an inch every 100 years. So please don't touch these if you go into a cave. Never touch a stalactite. You're touching something that's incredibly old and very fragile, and once you damage it, it's damaged, for a long time. The fastest growing stalactites are about 1/10, a little over 1/10 of an inch per year, or that's 1.5 inches every 100 years. That's the fastest growing. Show you a cutaway of a stalactite, really old one. This stalactite, and I don't know who did the cutting here. We'll say that it might have been damaged at some point, so they did a cutaway so they could look and see what was going on. But this particular stalactite is believed to be about 2.2 million years old, so that's pretty old. And just a couple of other views of here's a pretty well-known cave in southern New Mexico called Carlsbad Caverns. Pretty worthwhile place to go if you can. You see the person taking the photo over here from the trail. So this is actually something you can walk along a trail and experience the cave without going in and having to have special equipment. I put this up just so you can see things that look a lot like stalactites. This is a urban, you can call it an urban stalactite in a subway tunnel. May not form in exactly the same way, but the stalactites look sort of similar, so I put it on there. Okay, stalactites form from the bottom up. Same idea, dripping water. You don't always have a stalactite, or I should say a stalagmite, growing below a stalactite. They can form independently or together. But again, if it forms up from the bottom, it's a stalagmite. And here's a stalagmite growing up right here. By the way, if these things look wet, that's a good thing. Anything that's wet in one of these limestone caves is a living cave decoration. When these types of limestone caverns dry out, they die. So they start to actually crumble, fall apart, and the cave is approaching a point where it's actually dangerous to explore because there's a possibility of things falling, having collapses. But the natural state of a healthy limestone cave is to have water dripping in it all the time. So if you see things that look wet, that's a good thing inside a limestone cave. Here's a huge stalagmite in Carlsbad Caverns. You can see the lights. By the way, you don't see a lot of lights inside these caves. They try to keep the lights down because there's a problem with algae that forms. So in a lot of these caves, as you go through them, they'll shut off the lights when people aren't in a particular part of a cave. And they use special types of light that inhibit the growth of algae, because that's a real problem. And algae isn't something you would expect to find in a cave. Columns or pillars are where a stalactite and a stalagmite will come together. So here's my simulation here in this animation of those things kind of rapidly growing, kind of accelerated time, so you can see how the stalactite from the ceiling and the stalagmite from the bottom come together and form a column or pillar. Some other formations like draperies, and we'll look at a couple of different kinds of things you find in caves. But we might ask the question when we look at cave decorations: why are they different colors and shapes? Well, we can say that color does have an effect or is affected by the materials that we see in these cave decorations. So we can say white is often pure calcite. Iron and other materials produce a variety of different colors: the reds, the orange, the blacks, the black colors. The shape is determined by how water enters the cave. Does it enter by dripping, seeping, or splashing? Now let's take a look at some unusual cave decorations, just kind of walk through a little bit of a laundry list. These aren't really mentioned in detail in the book, but here's an example of something formed by air pressure. Argonite trees form where water is pushed through small passageways at high pressure. So very, very delicate things found in caves. Frostwork formed by the circulation of moist air that contains dissolved calcium carbonate. So these are also very, very delicate. These brushes are created by capillary action, where water is sort of pulled upward a little bit, and they're very unusual, also very delicate. Cave balloons, small gas-filled pouches, kind of strange looking. Some other types of features: popcorn is formed through evaporation of water, so we call this popcorn. Kind of looks like popcorn a little bit. Flowstone forms where water seeps out of cave walls. And as it notes here noted on the caption, growth rate of 1 inch every 100 years. So again, another illustration of the wetness that you find inside caves. That's very, very welcome thing for an active, living, vibrant cave. Here's uranium and flowstone that can be used to help determine the age of a cave. So you can measure the age of a cave by analyzing uranium that's found in flowstone. How about this? Cave bacon. It does look a little bit like bacon if you look at it carefully. How about a bottle brush? How do you think this cave feature is formed? So we have stalactites are sort of hanging down from the ceiling, and then this big bulbous thing on the bottom. Well, the way that's formed is the stalactite came first, and you see actually 2 bottle brushes in this example. And then what happened was the cave filled back up with water. So as the water level rose, that's where this stuff here formed on the outside of the stalactite when the water level rose. So that's something that was added later. Dripping water can also produce some pretty unusual things, like these things look like a fried egg, and you see there the dripping water. You can sort of visualize how dripping water might be responsible. Cave pearls form where dripping water into a pool loses carbon dioxide. So these are pretty unusual, these cave pearls. And we also have pool deposits that, like this shelfstone, that are kind of unusual. So this is water. You're actually looking at water there that's surrounding all these very unique cave decorations. This is one of the ones that I think is really interesting. Boxwork forms where you have very resistant veins of calcite that remain as surrounding rock dissolves. So this boxwork that's found in a cave in South Dakota is a remnant of where the rock actually and material actually extended out farther and eroded away and left behind these veins that were much harder and tougher. So it forms a boxwork. It was called boxwork because it kind of looks like mailboxes that you put mail into. So somebody named it boxwork. A little bit about cave systems, very briefly. Some caves are pretty big. And this shows Wind Cave in South Dakota is a pretty well-known cave, part of the National Park Service. The portion of Wind Cave that's open for tours is shown in the green and yellow. And they have another natural tour here that's shown in red that's quite a bit more ambitious. And I'll show you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. But this is a pretty good sized cave. And look at all the passageways that are not part of a tour. And you can get a permit in most of these caves that are on public property and go and explore for yourself, but you have to do certain things. You have to demonstrate you have equipment. You may have to demonstrate you have experience. You have to register with the organization, for example, the National Park Service, or in the case of if you go to Alabaster Caverns State Park here in Oklahoma, you have to register at the visitor center because they want to know that you're in the cave or where to find you if you don't show up, if you don't return. Here are those Wind Cave tour routes, the natural tour, and then a couple of the other tours that you can do. And again, you're just seeing a fraction of the cave, and you may only see one level. There may be a number of different levels. Here's the different levels represented in this slide that shows Oregon caves, and you see the cave main entrance. Here towards the bottom, you actually go upward when you go through the cave, and a couple of different exits. So these caves, we think of them as being two-dimensional, but they're really quite three-dimensional. In terms of wild caves, here's a cave in southern New Mexico. This has 145 miles of passageway. So this is a massive cave. So some of these caves don't even have names, and they're massive. They're huge. Here's the largest cave in terms of the height in the world. It's found in Vietnam. This cave, where this guy's standing in above, is tall enough to house, as I say in the caption, a 45-story building. So that's pretty amazing. And some of the longest cave systems in the world. I mentioned the biggest one in the world. We can take pride. It's in Kentucky in the U.S., Mammoth Cave, with 415 miles of passageways. And new passageways being discovered all the time. And a few other caves, Jewel and Wind Cave, are both in South Dakota. They're also pretty long. So longest cave systems in the world. And just to show you where caves are located, the concentration of caves here in Missouri and the northern part of Arkansas and the Ozark region. A lot of caves in and around Austin, Texas. So if you're a Texan, you're probably aware of that. Bat conservation organizations are headquartered in Austin, Texas, and then everywhere in the Appalachian Mountains, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then on up through parts of West Virginia, and on up into Pennsylvania. I want to mention briefly living things in caves. We can kind of divide caves into a couple different zones, and I created this image here so you could sort of appreciate different cave zones. So the entrance zone is a place where you'd see sunlight penetrate that area. The temperature would be fairly variable because it's kind of being controlled more or less by the outside temperature, temperature of the contributions by the sun, and you see some green vegetation. And then we have a twilight zone inside the cave where you'd find less light. Temperature changes would be more minor, moderated by being inside, minimal vegetation, maybe almost no vegetation. I've got my bats here shown in that area. And then we've got the dark zone, and that's deep in the cave, so no light, constant temperatures. So what kinds of animals might you find? Here's the entrance zone, what it might look like. And of course these fellows, these raccoons, other types of animals that spend a portion of their life outside the cave. You can almost always tell an animal that's not living exclusively in the cave or the dark zone of the cave because they have pigment, like the salamander and the squat lobster in the Canary Islands. So these are animals that may spend a portion of their life inside the cave and another portion outside the cave. The twilight zone, we see another set of animals living there. Here's some algae blooms. That's not necessarily a welcome thing in caves and not natural in a lot of caves, but we do find it in the twilight zone. And of course that's where we would typically find some concentrations of bats in the twilight zone. And then the dark zone. would only be illuminated in this picture with some sort of light source. And most of the animals, or really all the animals, are found in this zone are not really needing eyes. Oftentimes they don't have pigment because, well, who needs pigment? Because you're not. It's a biological response to light, and it's not really necessary. So you have these unusual types of creatures that are found in that dark zone. Here's a centipede that doesn't have pigment. Very briefly, a little bit about humans in caves, and early humans in caves, and a little bit about modern cave homes. So we know Neanderthals used caves. These are Neanderthal cave paintings. I've actually been to this cave in Guernica in Spain, and I've seen this image of the horse that's shown here. Here's a artist's conception of what a Neanderthal looked like 43,000 years ago. Today, caves are used for a variety of purposes. They're used as underground shelters, like air raid shelters, or bomb shelters from a nuclear holocaust or something like that. So they're used for that purpose. And then occasionally you see caves that are given a new purpose, like this cave home in Arkansas. And I thought I'd also mention that caves are a place where sort of real thrill seekers like to explore. And I look at this picture of this guy in scuba gear, these two people in scuba gear. I'm glad there's two of them. But caves can be explored, but they're extremely dangerous, especially caves where the only way to explore is using scuba gear. There's no place to escape. So you see signs like this one that sort of warn people before they go into these underwater caves to really think and really have the proper gear, proper training, and to think twice about even going, because it's just incredibly hazardous. And then just briefly, some natural entrances. This is the natural entrance to Carlsbad Caverns. If you go here, you can see this amazing display of bats as they exit the cave at dusk, and they go out to feed at night. So they feed all night long, and they come back in before light. So it's a really pretty spectacular sight to see these caves departing at dusk to feed, to eat insects. I promised you that I mentioned something about the historic cave tour. This is at Jewel Cave National Monument, and one of the things, if you want to go on the historic cave tour, you have to crawl through the cinder block, and that's what this guy has just done. It's not so much to see if you fit, it's to see if you freak out, and you can actually get through there. And let me show you why it's so important to go through this test at the visitor center before you try it, because it looks like this. And that would not be fun if you have claustrophobia and you don't really appreciate having someone right in front of you and someone right behind you. That's my problem with claustrophobia and looking from the other side. I thought I'd close by just mentioning that vandalism in caves is a problem. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, that these are some stalactites that have been damaged, where people have broken off samples. This is a terrible thing to do. So try to be respectful if you go in caves. Never, ever even touch the cave decorations. Leave them there for the next person to appreciate. One of the things that is a problem in some caves is graffiti, and people will write on the side of caves, and that's bad for the cave ecology. That can sometimes inhibit water movement through rock, and sometimes that graffiti can be there for a long time, much longer than perhaps anyone intended. So don't leave anything behind. Just go and enjoy the cave. And here's a volunteer removing lint. Lint is one of the big problems in caves that are part of tours, because what people do is they walk through the cave and they put their hands in their pockets and they pull their hands out, and some lint and also little bits of skin end up inside the cave, and sometimes that has to be carried out by the hundreds of pounds in some of the bigger caves like Mammoth Cave and Carlsbad Caverns that are very popular with the public.